It's hard to tell. We're with Alexander Salter, and you probably heard that we got more economic news, so we're going to talk to him about it. He's a professor of economics down in Texas Tech, the Rawls College of Business. He's a Young Voices contributor. You can find him writing all over the place, National Review, Washington Examiner, various other places. Alexander, how are you, sir?
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Hey, we keep asking this question over and over again when we have economists or people that know about the economy on the show. Once again, this week, we seem to have conflicting information. We have, for the fourth time in 2021, the numbers of workers quitting their job hit a record. And then we turn around this morning and wake up to news that jobs are added to the economy. This doesn't make sense to people. Why do we keep getting, it seems like conflicting information because we hear about labor shortages, but the unemployment numbers low. This just doesn't make sense to a normal person. You're an economics professor. Teach us, explain this to us, because I don't understand it.
It's a pretty tricky issue, Andrew, and this is a good place to start. So I think what we're really observing, and this is going to last for a while, is changes in the patterns of economic activity caused by the sudden stop, sudden start COVID economy. Things are still really out of whack. Businesses had to shut down, they had to restart again. Consumers were told they had to stay home, then they could go out again and purchase. You can't just restart an economy the same way that you reboot a computer. There are all sorts of patterns to economic activities that have to fit together like puzzle pieces, including in labor markets. So on the one hand, you have a number of people who are adjusting to new things like the ability to work from home instead of going into the office, taking advantage of the fact that household balance sheets are particularly strong right now, maybe pursuing that dream career change that they always wanted, at the same time that total spending in the economy is picking up and businesses are really trying to fill spots that just aren't being filled. So I think what we really have here is not a demand problem, but a mismatch problem. And that's going to take some time for the economy to work itself out. And really the only way for that is for markets to do what they do, allocate resources, link up consumers with producers, and wait for prices to adjust to make things work well again.
So what was the mismatch part? Was it a confluence of events? Was it just problems? Because it seems like some of the economic stuff with the COVID stuff was things that were already a problem. And then that extra pressure just kind of revealed the cracks. Was it, there's of course public panic with some of these things because people that can't get their kids to school and they can't work and things like that, that all adds into it. So what do you think it was that caused those things that made it a mismatch? Because obviously it's so unusual that we're seeing these things. This isn't kind of a naturally occurring event, for a lack of a better term. What do you think made the mismatch?
You're right. It was a confluence of events. It wasn't just any one thing. It was multiple things going wrong, well, quote unquote wrong at the same time. Obviously, COVID is tragic. It's terrible for the economy. There's not really a whole lot that we can do about it being there, but the policy responses that we chose do explain some of what's going on. Social distancing, stay-at-home orders. We already talked about the sudden stop, sudden start to economic activity. And again, on the demand side, you had rather extraordinary policy, both fiscal and monetary policy, to make sure that the total spending side of the economy didn't bottom out. That started in 2020 and really is continuing all the way through today. Lots of that policy is still going on. So when you have supply mismatches on the one hand, in the context of overall strong demand pressures on the other hand, that's a recipe for, on the one hand, inflation, which is what we're seeing right now. And then also on the other hand, markets are just having a really hard time sorting out which lines of production are feasible, where workers need to go. This is something that markets can do, but it's going to take time. And I would argue that public policy in the last couple of months to the last 18 months really has probably been a little bit more of a hindrance than a help to that.
Yeah, and you've been writing about this. You wrote about it in Washington Examiner and other places. The gist of it was that we're having supply side problems. So we need some supply side issues. You called it and called for supply side liberalism. Kind of explain that terminology, because some folks might kind of look at that like, what do you mean by supply side liberalism?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. So you hear supply side economics and you typically think of an economic and political program typically associated with the American right. Supply side economics to people means usually the proposition that if you cut taxes, then tax revenues will actually go up, because by cutting tax rates, you're going to incentivize so much more economic activity that people are going to produce more, spend more, so the overall size of the pie grows, tax revenues go up. Sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't, but that's not really what supply side economics is all about. Supply side economics focuses on the fundamental, indisputable point that the only way to raise income per person, the only way to make salaries go up over time, is for productivity to improve. If you want to consume more, you have to produce more. And so what we need to do in terms of public policy is make focused, targeted investments on improving those supply side conditions. The supply side is all about productivity, how good we are at turning the inputs we have at our disposal into outputs. The better at that we are, the more money we're going to come home with. I wrote that article in the context of the failure of President Biden's Build Back Better Act, because that was just too all-encompassing. There was just too much in there, too much corporate pork, too much stuff that just really shouldn't have been in there. But there was a kernel of a good idea in it, which is that strategic investments in the supply side, in human and physical capital, could actually improve economic conditions. Now, I myself am a conservative. I'm an economist of the right, so I'm not terribly fond of the idea of the federal government taking point on all this. But given that it seems to be a bipartisan consensus that we want the federal government to be making some of these investments, my way of thinking is let's at least make them good ones.
Does this play back into what we started with? Because I know people talk about the great resignation and all this movement in the labor market and people um, quitting their jobs or looking for other jobs. Does that go into the human capital that you're talking about? Because I think there's something underneath all this where it's just a lot of these service workers, let's just take service workers for an example. They have more information than they've ever had before. They have technology and social media to know what other people are making and what they're making. And then when you have a crisis like COVID and then the economic crisis on top of it, a lot of them, I think, just said enough. We want better. Isn't that part of this human capital you're talking about? Is just, I think people are just more tuned into it because of the crisis. And they don't think of it in an economic term, but I think just collectively, a lot of people are like, I want better and I'm going to do something better for me. And that's where some of this stuff is coming from.
You could definitely tell a human capital story there. So the way that would work is that workers in those lines of productions, as you said, think they can do better by taking this time, by using the fact that household balance sheets are particularly strong due to the fact that they couldn't really spend a whole lot except from home on Amazon maybe for a while. And of course, the direct checks from the federal government really made people flush with cash. If you're going to make investments in human capital, now seems like a particularly good time to do that. Those investments can be most effective if you specialize in being a student or a trainee worker or doing something other than traditional full-time employment. So that might be part of what's going on. The other part of it is that all these policies that we just talked about for other reasons might make workers slightly less willing to offer their labor services in general. And that's a more familiar supply side story, right? We only recently got over the time period where the federal government was being pretty generous in paying people not to work. Well, when you subsidize something, you get more of it. That's economics 101. Pay people not to work, people won't work.
Yeah. And the other part of this that we now have enough numbers on, because we got about 2 years of COVID data now, give or take, a large portion of those people leaving the workforce was actually older workers, workers that wanted to retire early or they wanted to downscale to part-time or whatever the case may be. What is it? Because a lot of economics for the last few years, there's a major generational shift. Of course, we hear ad nauseum about baby boomers, but it is a fact. You have a large portion of the working population that are phasing out, and that happened right in the middle of COVID on top of it. Talk about how that moves economic numbers as well. That's another human capital story, really. You just have this massive part of the workforce for the last 30, 40 years, and they've kind of thrown up their hands, a lot of them, and said enough.
Yeah, there's been some interesting trends in labor force participation. The labor force participation rate is basically the size of your labor force, right, divided by the number of people who are looking for jobs. And so when you actually get that number, it's telling you the fraction of adults who are actively looking for jobs, who want to be in the labor force as a percentage of the overall working age population. So what does that tell you? It basically tells you how much of your population you have tied up in economic concerns. And over the course of the pandemic, that figure fell by about 1%. We're in the neighborhood of 60% labor force participation right now, give or take a couple of percentage points. You probably want to fact check my figure on that. Now, that's the top line figure, but underneath all that, there's some really interesting stuff going on. So it's true that a lot of people who probably had 5 to 10 years more until retirement, conventionally understood, decided maybe they wanted to take it early. Maybe they wanted to take advantage of the fact that, again, household balance sheets are strong. So now seems like a pretty good time to readjust your plans and maybe get a little bit more out of retirement. That's one thing that's going on. But there are also a significant number of older workers, we're talking 55 and up, and especially 65 and up, who have re entered the labor force. They're taking other jobs. They're seeking employment and filling jobs when previously they weren't. So, on the whole, you do have labor force participation going down. But based on demographic trends underneath that top line number, it's not a very clean and clear story about the baby boomers retiring and then the young kids stepping up, but maybe they're not so willing to work as we would like. There's a lot of intergenerational stuff that cuts against the grain. And that's, I think, going to play into the labor market mismatch story that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, and let's take real quick talking to Alexander Salters on Hertel. Let's take the other end of that real quick. There's obviously a lot of movement among the very young, talking college age, quickly leaving college age. They are finding alternate things. You have the gig economy, the creator economy, these sorts of things. So while that's all going on, you have this new generation of people that are trying to find their way, and they're doing it in somewhat unconventional means. Also, they're not all just going into a career type career path, right?
That could be part of it. I don't really have a good handle on the fraction of college graduates or young people in that age category who are looking for a traditional 40 hours a week full-time employment versus people who are doing piece rate writing or gig economy work like driving for Uber or something like that. Based on the numbers that I have seen, that usually tends to be supplemental work, things that they do in addition to their full-time jobs, but it's not unheard of for people to engage in that piece rate work or contract work full-time. The interesting thing there is that states, depending on state level policy, sometimes make it very hard for people to be full-time contractors. It's harder in some states and easier in other states. And so I would really want to dig into the data and look at those trends as well.
Yep, looking at you, California. We're talking to Alexander Salter. We're going to continue with him in a minute. We're going to get into a little bit of the policy side of some of this stuff. Also, ask him a little bit about some supply chain stuff and one of our recurring topics of China. We'll continue with him on Heard Tell right after this. Welcome back to Heard Tell. We're with Alexander Salters. We're talking a little bit of economics and such. One thing is fine. I'm actually a transportation guy by trade. That's how I made a living before I could make a living that way anymore, and I became the world's least compensated writer. But I found it kind of heartening. The year 2021 was the year where I think we had a good public reckoning on folks understanding parts of the economy, such as the supply chain. And I know some of it was from panic and toilet paper and some of the silliness. Do you, as an economist, do you take it as a good sign, even though it was for bad reasons, that people maybe for the first time started paying attention to things like supply chains, like just-in-time ordering, how they actually get their goods in the store, just kind of some practical economic stuff? I think that's a good thing, isn't it?
I definitely think it's a good thing for the public to be more informed about just how many things have to go right in order for the goods and services that are on their shelves that they buy every day, how that actually happens. We take that for granted, right? We take for granted the miracle of the market. This is something that we try and really hit home when we teach our Econ 101 classes, we professors. The fact that you can go out and buy for a fraction of your hourly wage a fantastic meal is really a miracle. And when you count all the things that have to go into that, now it gets even more complicated when you have talking about things like computers that have semiconductors or cars that have smart chips in them, when those parts are serviced from all over the world. So on the one hand, it's good that the public has become more sensitized and aware of just how miraculous and sometimes fragile that can be. On the other hand, you do have to worry that public passions would get a little bit out of hand and the public policy responses demanded by the public might not be the best ones going forward. So, for example, when you have this public outcry about the fact that a lot of our medical supplies were coming through China, and China is a geopolitical rival. They're not necessarily a friendly nation to us, and we would want to make sure that those lines of production are protected. I understand that argument for national security reasons, and I'm willing to concede its force. My problem is when we uncritically generalize that insight to other goods and services as well. right? Whatever national security exceptions there are to repatriating strategic supply chains, we need to understand that the global division of labor is actually a good thing. Restricting it is going to make us poorer. There might be other reasons why we might want to restrict the global division of labor for other political goals. But I also worry that this focus on supply chains is going to kindle the fire of this sort of neo-mercantilist anti-trade ideology that you sometimes see on both the left and right. So that has me a little bit suspicious.
All right, there was a lot of really big words right there in that last little phrase. So let's zoom out for just a second, though. We just because I think people maybe don't, I know I don't fully comprehend it, even though I try to follow this stuff. Why is it that China dominates this so much? Just kind of explain it to me like I'm five for a second. Is it their 750 million strong workforce? Is it their geopolitics? Is it, the ability of their, obviously, the Chinese Communist Party to control the entire country? Why is it that they're so dominant? Because we just keep talking about it to the point that China is almost the buzzword now, and we don't really think about it. But just explain to people real quick why they're so dominant in our supply chain.
You hit on a number of really good reasons. One, just sheer size of the Chinese economy. Two, sheer size of the Chinese labor force. Three, the fact that China actually has an authoritarian political system which can treat the country as one big firm if it really wants to. Now, obviously, it doesn't have minute control over a lot of things that a conventional business firm would have, but the relationship of the Chinese Communist Party to that country's economy is categorically different than the relationship of the United States government to the United States economy, except during times of maybe a declared war, right? We can talk about the command economy that we had during the world wars earlier in the 20th century, but that's really the exception rather than the rule for liberal democracies. There are also economic forces at work. This just happens to be China's comparative advantage right now. China is a middle income country. We've talked a lot about meteoric economic growth from China over the past decades, and they have grown quite quickly. But let's keep in mind that GDP per capita in China is about the same as GDP per capita in Mexico. China is not yet a wealthy country. It's a middle income country, which means that it's going to specialize in producing these things like medical supply goods that largely consist of taking existing ideas for putting parts together and assembling a good and shipping it somewhere else. So we over relied, I think, on having our division of labor and international supply chains run through China because we were hoping that economic liberalization and integration into international institutions like the World Trade Organization would cause China's political system to liberalize, basically that they would become nice liberal democratic capitalists like us. Unfortunately, it has not worked out that way. And it seems that a lot of what our economic policy decisions have done with respect to China have really enriched an adversary that seems all too willing to use its weight to, to throw its weight around to cause us all sorts of problems.
And this goes to something that I know we share, but when we're talking about liberty and we're talking about freedom and we're talking about giving people the maximum opportunities, there's an overarching thread here because whether we're talking about something like the lockdowns for COVID, that's a freedom issue, but we're also talking about trying to liberalize a communist dictatorship in China, that's a freedom issue as well. Economics is freedom, and how you have economics and giving people opportunity is key to freedom. I know you write about this, you talk about it a lot, but just go into that for just a minute though, that if you don't have people having economic opportunity, the rest of these freedoms really don't mean a lot because they're not going to be able to do much with them.
There has been a perception that China has, quote unquote, liberalized its economy a lot over the last 30 years. And to the extent that we mean allowing market mechanisms and free exchange to operate more than had been operating previously, that's true. But it is absolutely not true that China's economy is a liberal capitalist economy by any stretch of the imagination. China is not a capitalist country. Its political system is straight up authoritarian. This is a freedom issue. This is a human freedom and human dignity issue. And that's why I, for one, am rethinking a lot of views that I had with respect to China and beginning to think that maybe strategic decoupling from China's supply chains might actually be best for US liberty in the long run.
Is it that we think, especially people our age, we are kind of ingrained with we brought down the Soviet Union through economic power and cultural power, and we just don't understand that that's just not going to work here. This is a totally different system. Is that just kind of ingrained into the American ethos of, well, we won the Cold War doing it this way, and that way ain't going to work with China? Is that part of the problem here?
Among the class of people who are policymakers, maybe, but they're actually a little bit older, right? America's quote unquote governing class is a generation older than ours. And the fall of the Soviet Union is probably the formative international relations experience of their lifetime. And that's probably where they're getting their playbook. For people our age or younger, I actually worry it's just the reverse. They don't have any experience of socialism. They don't have any experience of communist tyranny, which is why you have young people overwhelmingly approve. Well, I shouldn't say overwhelmingly approve because I don't think it's even in a majority yet. But compared to previous questions when they were asked in polls over the decades, a record high amount of young people, a fraction of young people, have favorable opinions to socialism and communism. And I think that that's just because they frankly don't know what those words mean and what those economic political systems entail. I'm very, very confident that if they got a whiff of that in terms of what it's actually to like to live under those systems, they would become liberal democratic capitalists very quickly.
Yeah. Talking to Alexander Salter. All right. Put your economic hat back on for a second. Where's the economy at? We hear all the noise. We hear all the panic. We have the screaming headlines. What's the actual condition of our economy right now as we enter into 2022?
The economy is not as bad as some of the doomsday prophets are saying, but make no mistake, we could be in a stronger position. The major issue right now is inflation. I still think that a major driver of inflation is supply side issues. When productivity goes down, all else being equal, turning inputs into outputs gets harder, which raises costs all throughout the economy, drives prices up. Now, that doesn't mean that monetary policy, what the Fed is doing in terms of printing money and buying all those assets, that doesn't mean monetary policy has nothing to do with it. It just means, I think, if we're being honest, we have to have a modest view of how much the Fed can bring this thing down. I would expect by the end of the year, inflation to fall back within fairly normal parameters, 2.5% to 3.5%. Labor markets, that's going to take a little bit longer to work out. Businesses are probably going to have to bite the bullet and just offer the wages that they're offering to employees. People wonder why all the Burger Kings across the country are empty. It's because all the owners of those franchises are paying or trying to get away with paying their workers $8.50 an hour at a time when there's record inflation, right? We haven't seen these inflationary numbers for 40 years. You're not going to be able to get away with paying the same salaries now as you could when inflation was only 10%. So when you look at all of that and look at the broader economic trends for the economy as a whole, we're doing okay with producing, we're doing okay with consuming. I think it's just going to take some time for those patterns of specialization and trade to readjust. And when they do, we'll be in better shape. My major concern going forward isn't even inflation. My major concern is the deficit. The federal government has taken on unfathomable amounts of debt to fight COVID. And that's really going to strain our borrowing capacity later. And if interest rates eventually start to go up, which I think they will, because interest rates usually go up when economic growth across the globe goes up, that's going to make it harder for Uncle Sam to borrow. We already have pretty high borrowing costs. We're going to quickly look at a situation where just paying the interest on the national debt is going to absorb something like 15% of GDP, which means we have less important public funds available for investing in those things that we want Uncle Sam to invest in. Especially with inflation running as high as it is right now, the last thing that we want to invite is a fiscal crisis. So as counterintuitive as it seems, now might be the time to tighten our belts.
One last question for Alexander Salter. We know that the deficit spending and this sort of thing, that's all kick the can down the road, though. Give me a time frame on that, kick the can down the road, because I know all of my life I've heard about the deficit. There's no real appetite politically and in the social conscience to really deal with that issue right now. There just ain't. That's just the truth of it. It's all lip service. 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. When's that bill come due?
I can't remember if it was Harry Truman or FDR who said, gee, I wish that I could meet a one-armed economist, because economists are always saying, well, on the one hand, but on the other hand, sorry, old economics joke. I use that fun story to introduce the fact that it really depends on something that I can't predict, which is how far and how fast interest rates are going to go up. We've gotten away with all the borrowing and all the deficit finance because for the past 30 years, interest rates have been trending downwards and they've been at near record lows for quite some time now, more than a decade. This is unusual. This isn't something that you can solely blame on monetary policy. Monetary policy can lower interest rates in the short run sometimes, but not in the long run. Something else is going on. As long as interest rates stay as low as they are, you can probably continue to sustain this amount of borrowing. But as soon as the cost of borrowing goes up, as soon as the interest service on the debt goes up, as soon as bond markets say, you know what, Uncle Sam, things aren't looking so good with your finances right now, I'm going to have to get paid a little bit more to lend you my money, that's when we could be in a world of hurt. It could happen next year. It could happen 15 years from now. I'm going to be perfectly honest with you. I don't know. I think the sanest approach, though, is not to wait for it to happen to make the necessary adjustments. Interest rates will go up at some point. We don't know when, but they will. It's better to have our fiscal house in order before that happens.
Yeah. Alexander Salter, he's explaining economics so well that even I can understand it. Let folks know where they can follow you on your social media and what you got going on, sir.
Sure. So I'm on Twitter. My handle is at Alex W. Salter. And you can find all of my writing, including my public writing, op-eds that I've published in places like National Review, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Examiner, and the American Mind at www.awsalter.com. And my email address is on my website too. I'm always happy to chat with readers. Drop me a line.
Yeah, we appreciate your time so much, Alexander Salter. Great resource. We'll definitely have you back because I got a feeling, especially since it's an election year, that we're going to be talking lots of it's the economy stupid this year. So thank you for your time, sir.
Sounds good, Andrew. Take care.
Thank you, sir.